They thought you were weak, but your silence, your stillness, your absence was the weapon that made them unravel. They thought your silence meant surrender. They mistook your patience for fear. They believed your calmness was weakness. But you weren't losing. You were watching them lie, manipulate and play their games until the weight of their own actions crushed them. You didn't have to fight them. You just had to step back. Because sometimes the strongest move you'll ever make is letting people destroy themselves with the very fire they lit to burn you. You think silence means I gave up. You think my calm was surrender. But what you never understood is that silence is a strategy. Real power doesn't beg. It doesn't explain. It watches. It calculates. It holds back not because it's afraid, but because it's 3 steps ahead. You mistook my stillness for weakness. Because you needed to, it made you feel big, important, like you had the upper hand, but that illusion was never mine to hold. It was yours to cling to. I didn't fight for your attention because I didn't need it. I didn't argue with your lies because I knew the truth would outlive your performance. I didn't scream when you tried to paint me as small because I knew the noise wouldn't save you when the silence turned on you. You see, I knew exactly what I was doing when I let go of control. It wasn't because I was powerless. It was because I didn't need to force anything. People always reveal themselves when you give them space. They show you who they really are when they think you're no longer watching. That's why I stayed quiet. That's why I let you talk. That's why I didn't defend myself, because I knew you would destroy yourself trying to hurt me. You thought you were winning while I was watching. You thought your games were working, that I was breaking under the pressure. But the thing is, pressure doesn't break the solid. It exposes the cracks, and the more you pushed, the more your own fractures showed. You started unraveling while I remained still. That's the power of restraint. It doesn't just protect you, it exposes them. I've learned that not everything deserves a reaction. Not every lie needs to be confronted. Not every betrayal needs a dramatic ending. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to step back and let the truth breathe. Let the silence work. Let them talk themselves into corners. Let them reveal the desperation behind their confidence. Because people like that, they don't know how to handle silence. They need noise. They need chaos. They need a target. When you refuse to be one, they implode. You thought I was confused. I was calculating. You thought I was stuck. I was studying. You thought I was broken. I was building. I watched you underestimate me with a smile. I watched you think you were in control of a situation I had already left. You thought the silence meant you were winning, but really it was the quiet before the consequences. And now you feel them. You feel the absence. You feel the shift. You feel the weight of not being able to provoke me. Because silence doesn't mean I'm gone. It means I'm no longer available for the version of you that needed me to lose. I'm not playing your game anymore. I'm not proving my worth to people who made the mistake of doubting it. I'm not trying to be heard by the very mouths that twisted my words. I don't need to win loud battles. I win in the quiet, where peace becomes proof, where growth becomes the echo of my strength, where your noise fades and my silence reigns. The thing you never saw coming was that my silence wasn't the end. It was the turning point. That was when I stopped defending and started detaching. That was when I stopped hoping and started healing. That was when I stopped reacting and started rising. I made peace with the fact that some people only understand your value when they can no longer reach it. Some people only feel the loss when they can't pull you back in. You underestimated the power of someone who doesn't need to be loud to be dangerous. You see, when you operate from strength, you don't need to chase closure. You don't need to explain your worth. You don't need to fight to be understood. You just fall silent. You let the dust settle. You let the truth take its shape. And in the aftermath, what's real remains. What's false crumbles. And those who tried to break you end up breaking themselves against the wall of your discipline. So no, I didn't lose. I didn't give up. I didn't back down. I chose silence because I knew it would say everything I didn't have to. And now, as the smoke clears, I hope you finally understand. My silence was never weakness. It was the warning. They thought they had you figured out. They looked at your patience and mistook it for fear. They looked at your kindness and assumed it was weakness. They looked at your silence and believed it was submission. But what they never saw, what their pride refused to let them see, was that their arrogance would become the very thing that worked in your favor. You didn't need to set a trap. They walked into it, eyes wide open, smiling, because they believed they couldn't lose. You didn't need to fight them directly. You didn't need to convince anyone of who you were. You just had to let them keep talking, keep boasting, keep believing they had outsmarted you. That was the beginning of their downfall. You see, arrogant people expose themselves when you stop feeding their illusion. They start acting louder, faster, more recklessly, because they need you to play along with the fantasy that they're superior. But when you sit still, when you stop reacting, it drives them insane. It forces them to reach further and risk more just to prove something that was never true in the first place. They thought you were standing still because you couldn't move. They didn't realize you were rooted because you knew the storm was coming, and you weren't the one in danger. It was them, because you understood something they never would. Real strength isn't loud. Real strength doesn't need to posture. It doesn't need to impress. It doesn't need to humiliate others to feel secure. You let them underestimate you, and that was your weapon. You didn't need to raise your voice or strike back. Their ego would do all the work for you. They pushed further and further, thinking you were too soft to push back. They believed their manipulation was working because you didn't interrupt them, but you knew what they didn't. You knew that truth doesn't need to interrupt lies. It just needs time. You gave them space. You gave them rope, and they used every inch of it to wrap themselves tighter into the mess they created. That's how arrogance works. It blinds people to consequences. It tricks them into thinking they're untouchable. That's where they lost. That's where you won. You never had to seek revenge. You never had to expose them. You just stood still while they pulled the trigger on their own downfall. And when it all came crashing down, they couldn't blame you. You didn't raise a hand. You didn't call for war. You didn't even defend yourself. You just let their arrogance turn inward, let it poison their own plans. You let them play themselves. That's what they get for thinking you were too humble to be dangerous. They taught themselves a lesson you were never going to waste energy teaching. And now that the dust has settled, they're left with the echo of their own ego. No applause, no crowd, just silence and the realization that you were never the weak one. You were just the one who didn't need validation, and that made you untouchable. Because when you don't need to be seen, no one can use your image against you. When you don't need to win the argument, they can't manipulate your words. When you don't seek revenge, they can't accuse you of bitterness. You just stay quiet, you stay sharp, and you let them fall. That's the beauty of it. You didn't have to get dirty. You didn't have to stoop to their level. You didn't have to match their noise. All you had to do was stand in your truth and wait. Let them scream, let them spin, let them throw the punches you never returned, because every blow they threw came from a place of desperation, not power, and desperation always exposes itself in time. You just had to be patient enough to let their arrogance do what you never needed to, and now you walk forward unbothered while they sit in the ruins of what they built with their own pride. That's what happens when people mistake self-control for weakness. That's what happens when they think they've outplayed someone who was never even playing the same game. You were never playing to beat them. You were watching them beat themselves, and you let them. That was your power, because in the end they weren't your enemy, their ego was. You ever notice how the loudest one in the room is usually the weakest, the one always making noise, throwing shade, puffing their chest? They're not in control, they're reacting, they're trying to prove something, but the one who sits still, who doesn't flinch, who holds steady even when things get loud, that's the one who's Dangerous? That's the one you never see coming, because the strongest hand isn't the one that moves first. It's the one that waits. It's the one that doesn't need to respond to every provocation. It's the hand that holds its position until the whole table shifts. People love to test your patience. They'll try to bait you, push your buttons, twist your words. They want you to lose composure so they can point and say, "See, look who they really are." But you didn't. You stayed calm. You stayed centered, not because you didn't feel the chaos around you, but because you refused to let it own you. That's what strength looks like. Not flailing, not yelling, not proving, just stillness, just control. You didn't swing back. When they came at you sideways, you didn't match their energy. When they got petty, you didn't try to win the argument or expose their lies. You let it all unfold without you. You didn't move, not because you couldn't, but because you knew exactly what your movement would cost, and you chose not to spend your energy on the undeserving. That's not passivity, that's power. See, people think reacting is strength, but that's just emotion on autopilot. Real strength is restraint. Real strength is knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to. It's watching someone try to rattle you, keeping your face unreadable. It's letting them waste their breath while you hold your silence like a loaded weapon. Because when you don't move, when you don't flinch, when you don't lower yourself to their level, you control the entire dynamic. You force them to reveal more of themselves than you ever reveal of you. You didn't respond to disrespect with drama. You didn't defend yourself to people who were never interested in the truth. You didn't beg to be seen or understood. You stood firm, and because of that, you watched them unravel. You watched them stretch further and further, trying to provoke a reaction that never came. You became a mirror to their chaos, and they couldn't stand it. That's the thing about insecure people. They need control. They need response. When you deny them that, you break their rhythm, and the more they reach, the more they expose how weak their position really is. Stillness is not weakness. It's the highest form of discipline. It's what separates the reactive from the relentless, the impulsive from the intentional. You could have burned it all down. You could have clapped back. You could have played the same dirty game, but you didn't, because you knew something they didn't. You're not here to win petty battles. You're here to win in silence, with peace, with purpose, with a long game they couldn't see coming. That moment they thought you were frozen in fear. You were grounded in focus. While they were performing for attention, you were watching everything. You didn't need to interrupt them. They gave you every answer with their actions, and by the time they realized you hadn't even started to move, it was already over for them. That's what happens when you confuse patience with paralysis. You made your move by not moving. You let them write the ending, and they didn't even know it. You see, it's easy to strike back. It's easy to yell. It's easy to get emotional when you're hurt. What's hard is standing still with your dignity intact, letting the truth do the talking. What's hard is not reacting when your silence is the most powerful response. You didn't just hold the strongest hand. You held it steady. While they collapsed trying to play games you already outgrew, you became untouchable by standing still. That's why you win, not because you shouted louder, but because when it mattered most, you didn't move and they did. They laughed at your silence. They called you passive, weak, naive. They said you were too calm, too forgiving, too quiet when they expected a fight. They mocked your restraint because they couldn't understand it. They saw the storm in you, but they thought your refusal to unleash it meant you didn't have one. But here's the truth. They weren't laughing because they were sure of themselves. They were laughing because your discipline made them nervous, and the only way they could feel big in your presence was to shrink you down to their level. They wanted to trigger you. They wanted to see you explode, to act out, to fold under pressure, because that would have made them feel justified. It would have proven their version of you. They were hoping you'd lose it, hoping you'd say something reckless or do something reactive just so they could point and say, "See." I told you, but you didn't. You held the line, you kept your tone steady, you chose not to match their chaos, and because of that, they hated you for the very thing they envied. Control. You didn't lash out, you didn't seek revenge, you didn't try to embarrass them the way they tried to embarrass you. You stayed in your lane, focused, steady, and they didn't understand it, because most people don't know what real power looks like. They think it's loud, they think it punches first, they think it screams and dominates and proves itself constantly. But power doesn't need to be performative. Power doesn't need to announce itself. Real power moves in silence, and your restraint, that was power in its purest form. They thought you were holding back because you were afraid. No, you were holding back because you were in command. You knew exactly what kind of damage you could do, but you chose not to, and that's the difference. They acted out of impulse. You moved with intention. They reacted emotionally. You responded with clarity. That's what scared them. That's what made them uncomfortable. You weren't playing the game they expected. You weren't following their script. And when you didn't take the bait, when you didn't swing back, it exposed something ugly in them, because deep down they knew they'd already lost the moment you decided not to fight them. What they never realized is that restraint is strength disguised, the ability to walk away instead of burn it all down. That's rare, the power to choose dignity over drama. That's leadership. You weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you knew your energy was too valuable to waste proving yourself to people who had already made up their minds. You didn't defend your character because your actions would do it for you in time. You didn't respond to the lies because you knew the truth would echo louder when the dust settled. Let them mock it. Let them laugh. Let them tell their stories. That noise, that's temporary, but your restraint, that leaves a permanent imprint. That's what they'll remember when everything else fades, because while they were exhausting themselves trying to provoke you, you were building something they couldn't touch, your peace, your purpose, your future. You weren't just avoiding the fight. You were winning it in a different way, quietly, completely, and without ever lowering your standards. They thought you didn't have claws because you didn't scratch. They thought you didn't have fire because you didn't burn them down. But fire doesn't need to rage to be real. Sometimes it just simmers, controlled, contained, and far more dangerous than the wildfire they expected. You didn't need to show them your wrath. You just needed to show them your absence. That was enough. That was everything. The ones who mock restraint are usually the ones who have never tasted real discipline, because restraint isn't about being soft, it's about being sharp. Focused, in control of yourself even when everything around you is trying to pull you off center. That's not weakness. That's power at its highest level. That's why they couldn't shake you. That's why they lost while you never lifted a finger. Because the whole time they were mocking you, you were mastering yourself. You didn't walk away because you were scared. You didn't let go because you were weak. You stepped back because you saw something they didn't. You knew that without your energy, without your reaction, without your willingness to engage in the fight, they'd fall apart. And you were right. Some people don't know who they are without conflict. They feed on drama. They survive off manipulation, off being able to control someone else's peace. And when you stopped giving them that battle, when you chose silence over war, it wasn't surrender. It was a calculated decision to let them collapse under their own weight. You saw through them. You saw how much effort they put into provoking you, into pushing your buttons, into trying to drag you into something messy, not because they were strong, but because they were afraid of what they'd have to face if you stopped showing up. They were never trying to destroy you. They were trying to keep you in a fight you'd already outgrown, because as long as they could keep you engaged, they had power. As long as they could get a rise out of you, they had purpose. But when you stopped showing up to the battle, when you let go of need to be right, to be heard, to be understood, they were left swinging at the air. That's when the unraveling started. That's when the cracks started to show. You didn't have to retaliate. You didn't have to expose them. You just had to remove yourself from the equation, and suddenly they couldn't breathe. That's what happens when someone builds their identity around controlling you. When they rely on your energy to survive, your absence becomes their downfall. You knew that. That's why you didn't fight. That's why you didn't argue. You understood that without you, they'd have to face their own emptiness, and they weren't ready for that. You were the anchor, the mirror, the emotional supply, the steady one, and when you stopped playing the role they cast you in, their performance fell apart. They mocked you when you left. They called you a coward, said you were running, but the truth was they were terrified of what your silence meant, because it wasn't just silence. It was power, it was closure, it was the final door closing on the only source of control they ever really had. And the best part, you didn't have to lift a finger, no revenge, no retaliation, just space, just stillness, and that silence exposed them louder than any argument ever could. They told everyone you were the problem. They spun the story, but slowly their own behavior started to contradict the lies. They got sloppy. They overreached. They couldn't keep the mask on without you there to balance them out. That's what you knew from the beginning. That's what you were counting on. Not because you were bitter, but because you trusted time more than you trusted your own rage. See, you learned something powerful. Not every war needs to be fought. Some people aren't worth the scars, and sometimes the greatest victory comes from not engaging at all. Let them self-destruct. Let them talk. Let them reach and twist and spiral. You didn't lose anything by walking away. You preserved your peace. You protected your future. And while they were busy trying to pull you back into the fire, you were already rebuilding in silence. They thought they could only lose if you beat them. They never imagined they could lose by being left alone, but they did, because they needed conflict. They needed noise. They needed a target to project onto. When that disappeared, they were left with themselves. And that was the one thing they never learned how to face. You gave them that moment, not through revenge, not through drama, through silence, through distance, through unwavering discipline. You knew all along that they couldn't sustain the illusion without you in the frame. You knew their identity would crumble once you stopped holding it up. And now, watching from a distance, you see it happening just like you knew it would. It's not about being right. It's not about seeing them fall. It's about recognizing that your greatest power was never in winning the fight. It was in walking away from it completely, cleanly, and never looking back, because they were never built to stand without conflict, and you were never built to stay in the fire. They hated you, but not because of what you did. They hated you because of what you showed them. You didn't try to hurt them. You didn't try to expose them. You simply existed as you were. Calm, steady, honest, and that was enough. Because being around you meant seeing themselves clearly, maybe for the first time, and they couldn't handle that. You didn't have to say a word to confront them. You didn't need to accuse, insult, or attack. All you had to do was be real, and the truth of who you were made the lie they lived in start to unravel. That's what mirrors do. They don't lie. They don't judge, they don't scream or chase, they just reflect. And you were the mirror they never asked for but couldn't avoid. You brought light into a place they had kept dark for a long time, and the moment your presence started revealing their cracks, their insecurities, their false strength, they turned on you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your authenticity made their illusion harder to maintain. They claimed you made them uncomfortable, that you were cold, distant, disconnected, but the truth was, they couldn't stand how seen they felt around you. They couldn't fake who they were in your presence. You didn't play along with the version of them they sold to everyone else. You didn't clap for the mask. You didn't validate the performance, and the more real you stayed, the more threatened they felt. Not by what you said, but by what you didn't have to say. They projected their worst fears onto you. said you were arrogant, that you thought you were better, but all you did was hold your ground. All you did was stay calm when they got loud. All you did was speak truth when they tried to twist it. You didn't need to match their drama because the truth in you was already louder than their noise. You didn't need to expose them. They exposed themselves trying to break the mirror you became. That's what they never understood. The more they attacked you, the more they revealed what they were trying to hide. The more they tried to bring you down, the more obvious it became that they weren't fighting you. They were fighting their own reflection. You just stood there, still, honest, clear, and that kind of presence forces people to either level up or lash out. They chose to lash out. They couldn't take accountability, so they blamed you for the parts of themselves they didn't want to face. You reminded them of the work they still hadn't done, the healing they never pursued, the growth they kept avoiding. You weren't cruel, you were consistent, you weren't judgmental, you just weren't playing the game, and that alone made you dangerous in their eyes. Because it meant you couldn't be controlled, swayed, or manipulated. It meant they couldn't hide anymore, not around you. The hardest part, you cared, you really did. You didn't want to be their enemy, you wanted to help them grow. You wanted them to see what you saw, that they could be more, do more, live freer if they just let go of the mask, but they weren't ready. So instead of growing, they attacked the thing that triggered the growth. And in the end they didn't walk away because you changed, they walked away because you stayed the same, and that forced them to confront the fact that they hadn't. You see it now, looking back, you realize you never needed to fight. You never needed to convince them of anything, you just needed to keep being exactly who you were, because your authenticity alone did more damage to their illusions than any argument ever could. And while they were spinning, while they were blaming, while they were building stories to justify why they couldn't stand you, you were simply reflecting back the truth they weren't strong enough to face. Let them talk, let them run, let them rewrite history. You never needed validation from people who couldn't even be honest with themselves. You weren't their villain, you were their mirror, and that was always too much for them, because the truth didn't destroy them, it just refused to be ignored. And now, you understand, you never needed to defend your silence. You never had to explain your calm. They thought you were weak, but you were watching. They mocked your restraint, but it was power. They came with noise. You answered with stillness. You were the mirror, and they shattered themselves. You didn't lose control. You gave it up on purpose. You didn't fight the war. You let them collapse without it, because the strongest hand is the one that doesn't move. You weren't the villain in their story. You were the truth they couldn't unsee, and in the end that was enough. So let them talk, let them twist the ending. You're not here to be understood, you're here to become undeniable. Your silence was strategy, your stillness was strength, your absence, that was the loudest answer. They never broke you, they just exposed themselves trying. Now walk away, not as someone who was quiet, but as someone who was always in control. Goodbye, and never look back.